The October sun in Nashville beat down hard on the Broadway sidewalk, even with autumn approaching. The golden leaves of the trees contrasted with the intense movement of tourists and locals circulating through the heart of country music America. It was one of those typical Tennessee days when the heat still persisted, but the wind already carried the promise of cooler days ahead. Garth Brooks walked down the main street with his characteristic hat pulled low, trying to maintain some anonymity. After decades in the spotlight, he had mastered the art of blending into crowds, though his imposing figure and distinctive gait often gave him away to keen observers. Today, however, his mind wasn't on avoiding recognition. It was on the music industry meeting he'd just left, where executives had spent 2 hours discussing profit margins and market penetration rather than the soul of country music. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, walking through the very streets that had shaped him as an artist, surrounded by the honky-tonk bars and music venues where dreams were born and sometimes shattered, while corporate boardrooms determined the fate of aspiring musicians based on algorithms and demographic studies. As he approached the intersection of Broadway and 4th Avenue, a small figure caught his attention. Sitting on a worn blanket against the brick wall of a vintage clothing store was a young girl, probably no older than 17, with long auburn hair that caught the afternoon light. Her clothes were clean, but clearly second-hand. A faded blue t-shirt and jeans with carefully mended patches at the knees. What struck him most, however, was her posture. Straight-backed and dignified despite her circumstances, and unmistakably pregnant. In front of her was a modest display of homemade treats, chocolate chip cookies wrapped in clear plastic bags, brownies cut into perfect squares, and what appeared to be fudge arranged on a small cardboard tray. A handwritten sign in neat cursive read, "Homemade sweets, $2 each. Every penny counts. Thank you for your kindness." Madison Parker had been sitting there for 3 hours, and so far, she'd sold exactly 4 cookies and 2 brownies. $12. Not nearly enough for what she needed, but every dollar brought her a little closer to making it through another day. Her back ached from sitting on the hard pavement, and the baby seemed to be pressing against her ribs more insistently today. But she couldn't afford to give up. She watched the endless stream of people walking by. Some glanced at her with sympathy, others with judgment. Most simply looked through her as if she were invisible. She'd grown accustomed to all 3 reactions over the past 2 months since she'd been living on her own. The sympathy was kind but rarely translated into sales. The judgment stung, but was manageable. The invisibility was perhaps the hardest to bear. When her parents, Robert and Linda Parker, had discovered her pregnancy 3 months ago, the explosion had been immediate and devastating. Her father, a deacon at their local Baptist church in Franklin, Tennessee, had called her a disgrace to the family name. Her mother, who had always been more concerned with appearances than with understanding, had declared that Madison was no longer welcome in their home. "What will people think?" her mother had shrieked. "How can we show our faces at church? At the country club? You've ruined everything we've worked for." Madison had tried to explain about Tyler Richardson, her boyfriend of 2 years, how he'd promised to stand by her, how they'd talked about getting married after graduation. But Tyler's courage had evaporated the moment his parents learned about the pregnancy. The Richardsons were even more prominent in Franklin's social circles than the Parkers, and their son's future at Vanderbilt University was not going to be derailed by what they called a teenage mistake. Sipur. Within a week, Tyler had blocked her number and was dating Jennifer Walsh, the daughter of Franklin's mayor. Madison had received a text from Tyler's mother offering to pay for taking care of the problem, but Madison had deleted it without responding. She'd already made her choice, and it didn't involve erasing the life growing inside her. Now, at 7 months pregnant, she was entirely on her own. She dropped out of Franklin High School, though she'd been an honor student with plans to study education at Middle Tennessee State University. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now. Her new reality consisted of the small efficiency apartment she rented week to week in East Nashville, paid for with the money she made selling her baked goods on the street. The apartment was in a rundown complex where the heating barely worked and the neighbors played music too loud at all hours. But it was hers. More importantly, it was clean and safe, and the elderly landlord, Herman Rodriguez, had taken pity on her situation and charged her far less than market rate. Madison had always been good at baking. It was one of the few activities she'd shared with her grandmother before the old woman passed away when Madison was 14. Grammy Parker had taught her the secret to perfect chocolate chip cookies, a touch of sea salt, the importance of room temperature ingredients, and how to tell when brownies were done without a toothpick. The edges would just start to pull away from the pan. More than the techniques, though, Grammy had taught her that baking was an act of love. When you put something sweet into the world, she used to say, you make it a little bit better. Madison clung to that philosophy now, especially on days when the world felt anything but sweet. Garth Brooks stood about 10 feet away, observing this young woman who couldn't have been much older than his own daughters. Something in her demeanor reminded him of his youngest, Allie, though Allie had every advantage in life that this girl clearly lacked. There was a strength in the way she sat, a refusal to be diminished by her circumstances that spoke to something deep in his soul. He'd seen plenty of people down on their luck in his years of fame. Nashville was full of dreamers and strugglers, but there was something different about this situation. This wasn't someone who'd come to town chasing stardom and fallen short. This was pure survival, and it was happening to someone who should have been worried about homecoming dances and college applications, not where her next meal was coming from. The businessman in him noticed the quality of her display, the careful attention to presentation, the polite sign that asked for kindness rather than demanding charity. The father in him saw a child who should have been protected and supported, not sitting alone on a street corner. The human being in him simply saw someone who needed help. Madison looked up as a shadow fell across her blanket. She'd learned to read people quickly over the past few months. It was a survival skill. The man standing in front of her was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing expensive boots and a hat that suggested he wasn't a tourist. His face was kind but weathered, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who'd lived fully. Something about him felt familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the warm drawl of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the South. "Those cookies look mighty fine." "Thank you, sir," Madison replied, straightening up a little. "They're made fresh this morning. Chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, and snickerdoodles. The brownies are double chocolate, and the fudge is vanilla and chocolate swirl." "Your grandmother's recipes?" he asked, something in his tone suggesting he understood the weight of such inheritance. Madison's eyes widened slightly. "How did you—" "Yes, actually. How did you know?" "Just a guess. That kind of care usually comes from somewhere deep. Someone who mattered taught you to bake like that." For a moment, Madison felt the sting of tears she'd trained herself not to cry in public. She did. She said baking was an act of love. Smart woman. He crouched down so they were at eye level, his knees creaking slightly with the movement. "What's your name?" "Madison. Madison Parker." "Well, Madison Parker, I'm Garth, and I think I'd like to buy everything you've got here." Madison blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Everything. The cookies, the brownies, the fudge, all of it." "How much would that be?" Madison's mind raced as she tried to count her inventory. She had maybe 30 items total, at $2 each. $60, sir, but That's a lot of sweets for one person. Garth smiled, the expression transforming his face entirely. I've got a big family, and a sweet tooth that's gotten me in trouble more than once. He pulled out his wallet and extracted 4 $20 bills. Keep the change. Sir, that's too much. I can't. You can, and you will. His tone was gentle but firm. That baby you're carrying is going to need a lot of things, and every little bit helps. Madison stared at the money in his outstretched hand, more cash than she'd seen in weeks. Her pride warred with her desperation, and desperation won. With shaking hands, she accepted the bills. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I might have some idea." He began carefully placing her baked goods into the paper bags she'd brought for customers. "Madison, can I ask you something? Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Someone looking out for you?" The question hit closer to home than she'd expected. "I have an apartment. It's small, but it's mine. And I'm managing." "Managing alone?" Madison's silence was answer enough. Garth finished packing the last of the brownies and stood up, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I own a restaurant here in town. Nothing fancy, just good food and honest work. We're always looking for people who know their way around a kitchen." "I don't have experience in restaurants," Madison said quickly, "and I don't know how much longer I can—" She gestured toward her belly. "Experience can be taught. And as for the rest, well, we've had pregnant employees before. It's not exactly uncharted territory." He pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. "This is the manager, Sarah Chen. Tell her Garth sent you. She'll take good care of you." Madison looked at the card. It was for a place called the Backstage Cafe on Music Row. She'd walked past it a dozen times, but never imagined she could afford to eat there, much less work there. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Garth was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I've got 3 daughters of my own. If one of them was ever in your situation, scared, alone, doing everything she could to survive, I'd hope someone would step up. Someone would see her as a person worth helping, not a problem to ignore." He adjusted his hat and picked up the bags of sweets. "Besides, my grandmother always said that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they do with what they've been given. You've been given a hard situation, and you're handling it with grace and dignity. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Madison felt tears threatening again. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess up?" "Everyone messes up, Madison. The difference is whether you've got people around you who'll help you get back up." He smiled again. "Go see Sarah tomorrow. And Madison, your grandmother was right about baking being an act of love, but sometimes accepting help is an act of love too. Love for yourself and that baby." As Garth walked away, Madison sat in stunned silence, clutching the business card and the money. For the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope, not just for tomorrow, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she and her baby were going to be okay. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across Broadway. Madison carefully folded her blanket and gathered her now empty containers. As she stood up, feeling the familiar ache in her back, she looked in the direction Garth had gone. He was already lost in the crowd, just another figure among the many walking Nashville's most famous street. She didn't know who he was beyond his first name, but she knew he'd just changed her life. Tomorrow, she would walk into the Backstage Cafe and take the first step toward building something better for herself and her child. Tonight, she would go home to her small apartment, make herself a real dinner with the money he'd given her, and allow herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first real bite of autumn in the air. Madison had barely slept, her mind racing between excitement and terror about the opportunity Garth had presented. She'd spent most of the night researching the Backstage Cafe online, learning that it was a well-regarded establishment that catered to both music industry professionals and regular folks who appreciated good food and a warm atmosphere. She'd also tried to figure out who Garth was. Something about him had nagged at her all evening. The way people had looked at him on the street, the quality of his clothes, the confidence in his voice when he'd spoken about owning a restaurant. But her internet searches for Garth Nashville restaurant owner had yielded nothing conclusive, and eventually she'd given up. Whoever he was, he'd been kind to her, and that was what mattered. Madison stood in front of her small closet, trying to decide what to wear to meet Sarah Chen. Her options were limited. Most of her pre-pregnancy clothes no longer fit, and she'd been making do with a few maternity items from Goodwill and the stretched-out remnants of her old wardrobe. Finally, she settled on a navy blue blouse that accommodated her growing belly and a pair of black pants that were comfortable enough to wear all day if she was lucky enough to be hired. The walk to Music Row took 25 minutes from her East Nashville apartment, but Madison didn't mind. She'd been walking everywhere for months now, unable to afford bus fare on most days. The exercise was good for her and the baby, and it gave her time to think and observe the city that had become her home. Nashville was a city of contrasts, gleaming new developments alongside honky-tonk bars that had been serving beer and dreams for decades. Corporate headquarters for major record labels shared blocks with tiny venues where unknown singers poured their hearts out to crowds of 10 people. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost daily, where talent and luck intersected in ways that could either launch careers or leave dreams shattered. Madison had never been particularly interested in the music business, despite growing up so close to its epicenter. Her dreams had always been more modest: teaching elementary school, maybe getting married to Tyler, raising a family in a house with a garden where she could grow vegetables and herbs for her baking. Those dreams felt naive now, but she was beginning to think that maybe naivety wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was just another word for hope. The Backstage Cafe was located in a converted Victorian house painted sage green with white trim. A wraparound porch held several small tables, and the front door was adorned with a simple wooden sign featuring the restaurant's name in elegant script. Through the large windows, Madison could see warm lighting and exposed brick walls lined with vintage photographs of musicians. She stood on the sidewalk for a full 5 minutes, gathering her courage. Her stomach was doing somersaults that had nothing to do with the baby, and her palms were sweaty despite the cool morning air. This was it. Potentially her first real job. Her chance to move beyond survival mode and start building something stable. Taking a deep breath, Madison pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The interior was exactly what she'd expected from the exterior. Cozy and welcoming, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together perfectly. The walls were covered with photographs of musicians, some famous, others clearly local artists capturing moments in time. An old upright piano sat in one corner, its surface polished to a warm shine. The breakfast crowd was just beginning to thin out, and Madison could see servers clearing tables and resetting them for lunch. The kitchen was visible through a pass-through window, and she could hear the sounds of preparation, chopping, sizzling, the clink of pots and pans. "Can I help you?" A woman approached from behind the host stand. She was probably in her early 40s, with glossy black hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read, Sarah. "Ms. Chen, I'm Madison Parker. Garth told me to come see you about a possible job." Sarah's expression immediately shifted from polite professionalism to genuine warmth. "Madison!" "Yes, he called me about you. I'm so glad you came in. Please, sit down." She gestured toward a quiet table near the window. "Can I get you something to drink? Some water? Coffee?" "Water would be wonderful, thank you." Sarah disappeared briefly and returned with a large glass of ice water and a plate containing a warm blueberry muffin. "On the house," she said, noticing Madison's questioning look. "You look like you could use some fuel." Madison's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, reminding her that she'd been too nervous to eat breakfast. "Thank you. That's very kind." "So," Sarah settled into the chair across from Madison, "Garth tells me you're an excellent baker and that you're in need of steady work." "I am. I've been selling baked goods on the street, but it's not really sustainable, especially with—" Madison gestured toward her belly. "When are you due?" "Mid-January. About 3.5 months?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That gives us some time to get you trained and settled. Tell me about your baking experience." Garth was pretty impressed with what he tasted yesterday. Madison felt herself relaxing slightly as she talked about her grandmother's recipes, her techniques, the satisfaction she found in creating something that brought joy to others. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about her favorite things to bake, her experience with large quantities, her comfort level with trying new recipes. "We do all our baking in-house," Sarah explained. "Our current baker, Margaret Thompson, is wonderful, but she's been talking about cutting back her hours. She's in her 70s and has been doing this for longer than I've been alive. I think she'd love to have someone to train, someone who could eventually take over some of her responsibilities. I would love to learn from someone with that much experience," Madison said honestly. "I know I have a lot to learn about commercial baking. The technique is different, but if you understand the fundamentals, which it sounds like you do, the rest is just practice and patience." Sarah paused, studying Madison's face. "Can I ask about your situation? Garth mentioned you're on your own?" Madison felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she had to explain her circumstances. "My family. They weren't supportive of my decision to keep the baby. The father isn't involved. So yes, it's just me." "That takes incredible courage," Sarah said quietly. "And I want you to know that if you work here, you'll have our support. We're like a family in this place. We look out for each other." "I don't want special treatment," Madison said quickly. "I just want to work hard and earn my way." "Working hard isn't the only thing that matters, Madison. Letting people help you when you need it is just as important. That's something I learned the hard way myself." Sarah's tone suggested there was a story there, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she stood up. "Would you like to meet Margaret and see the kitchen?" Madison nodded eagerly, following Sarah through the dining room toward the back of the restaurant. The kitchen was larger than it had appeared from the dining room, with professional-grade equipment and a large baking station, complete with multiple ovens, a commercial mixer, and endless counter space. At the baking station stood a small, energetic woman with silver hair pulled back in a hairnet. Her hands were covered in flour, and she was in the process of shaping what appeared to be dinner rolls. She looked up as Sarah and Madison approached. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Madison Parker. She's the baker Garth told us about." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and extended one to Madison with a warm smile. "Pleased to meet you, dear. Sarah tells me you learned from your grandmother." "Yes, ma'am. She taught me everything I know about baking." "The best teachers," Margaret nodded approvingly. "What was her specialty?" "Cookies, mostly. But she could make anything. She had this way of knowing exactly when something was done, just by the smell." Margaret's eyes lit up. "A baker's intuition. You can't teach that. Either you have it, or you don't. Tell me, what do you smell right now?" Madison inhaled deeply. sorting through the various aromas in the kitchen. Yeast rolls, about 5 minutes from being done. Something with cinnamon. Coffee cake, maybe? And vanilla. Something with a lot of vanilla that's been baking for a while. Pound cake, Margaret said with satisfaction. Been in the oven for 45 minutes. Most people can't distinguish individual scents like that, especially not in a kitchen this busy. Sarah and Margaret exchanged a look that Madison couldn't quite interpret. Would you be willing to start with part-time hours? Sarah asked. Maybe 3 days a week to begin with, working alongside Margaret to learn our systems and recipes. The pay would be $12 an hour to start, with the opportunity to increase as you take on more responsibilities. Madison's heart leaped. $12 an hour was more than she'd ever made, and even part-time, it would provide the stability she desperately needed. I would be very grateful for that opportunity. When could you start? Tomorrow, if you need me. Margaret laughed. I like her already. Sarah, why don't we have her come in tomorrow morning? I can show her our basic recipes and see how she handles the equipment. That sounds perfect. Sarah turned back to Madison. 6 a.m. start time. I know it's early, but that's when we do most of our baking for the day. 6 a.m. is fine. I'm used to early mornings. As they walked back through the dining room, Sarah stopped at the host stand and pulled out a folder. Here's some paperwork for you to fill out, tax forms, employee handbook, that sort of thing. Bring it back completed tomorrow morning. Madison accepted the folder with hands that were only slightly trembling. Ms. Chen, I can't thank you enough. This opportunity, it means everything to me. Thank Garth when you see him, Sarah replied. And Madison? We're glad to have you. I have a feeling you're going to be a wonderful addition to our team. As Madison walked home, clutching the folder of paperwork, she felt lighter than she had in months. Not just because of the job, though that was incredible, but because of the way Sarah and Margaret had treated her. Not as a charity case or a problem to be managed, but as a person with value and potential. She thought about Garth again, wondering who he was and why he'd chosen to help her. She'd asked Sarah about him, but Sarah had just smiled and said, "He's a good man who believes in helping people when he can." That non-answer had only deepened the mystery, but Madison found she didn't mind. Some gifts didn't need to be understood, just accepted with gratitude. That evening, Madison sat at her small kitchen table, filling out the employment paperwork. Under emergency contact, she hesitated for a long moment before writing down Herman Rodriguez, her landlord. He was the closest thing she had to family now, and she knew he would help if something happened to her. As she completed the forms, Madison allowed herself to imagine what life might look like in a few months. A steady job, health insurance, the ability to save money for the baby's arrival, maybe even the possibility of taking some night classes eventually, working toward the teaching degree she'd always wanted. For the first time since learning she was pregnant, Madison felt like she might actually be able to build the kind of life she wanted for herself and her child. It wouldn't be the life she'd originally planned, but it might be something even better. A life she'd earned through her own hard work and determination, supported by the kindness of people who saw her worth, even when she struggled to see it herself. Tomorrow would be her first day at the Backstage Cafe. Tonight, she would get a good night's sleep and prepare to take the next step in her journey toward independence and security. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was also full of possibility. Madison's alarm went off at 4:45 a.m., but she was already awake, staring at the ceiling and running through everything she knew about commercial baking. Her stomach was a tangle of excitement and nerves, and the baby seemed to be responding to her anxiety with more movement than usual. She'd laid out her clothes the night before, the same navy blouse and black pants from her interview. but with comfortable shoes that could handle long hours on her feet. The walk to the backstage cafe in the pre-dawn darkness was peaceful in a way that Nashville rarely was. The streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck, and the air was crisp enough that Madison could see her breath. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light along Music Row, and she could see lights beginning to come on in windows as the city slowly awakened. Margaret was already in the kitchen when Madison arrived, her silver hair neatly contained under a hairnet, her hands busy measuring flour into the large commercial mixer. "Right on time," Margaret said approvingly. "That's the mark of a good baker, reliability. People depend on their morning pastries, and we can't let them down." "What can I do to help?" Madison asked, tying on the apron Sarah had given her the day before. "Today you watch and learn. Tomorrow you start participating. I've found it's better to understand the full scope of what we do before jumping in." Margaret gestured toward a stool near the baking station. "Make yourself comfortable, but ask questions whenever something doesn't make sense." For the next 2 hours, Madison watched Margaret work with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft. The older woman moved through the kitchen with purposeful grace, her experienced hands shaping dough, adjusting oven temperatures, and timing multiple baking projects simultaneously. "The key to commercial baking," Margaret explained as she slid trays of scones into one of the ovens, "is organization and timing. Everything has to be coordinated so that fresh items are coming out of the ovens just as we need them for service." Madison took mental notes on everything. The way Margaret tested doneness by gently pressing the tops of muffins, the technique she used to ensure even browning on croissants, the careful attention to oven rotation to compensate for hot spots. It was like watching a master class in efficiency and precision. "Your grandmother taught you well," Margaret observed, as Madison correctly identified the moment when a batch of cinnamon rolls was perfectly golden. That instinct for timing can't be taught. Either you feel it or you don't. By 8 a.m., the kitchen was filled with the aromas of fresh bread, pastries, and coffee cake. The morning rush was beginning in the dining room, and Madison could hear the sounds of servers calling out orders and the espresso machine working overtime. "Tomorrow, you'll help with the mixing and basic prep," Margaret said as they began cleaning up the workspace. "Today, I want you to taste everything we've made and take notes on the recipes I'll give you to study." Margaret handed Madison a notebook bound in green leather. "This was mine when I was learning. Each recipe includes not just ingredients and instructions, but notes about common problems and how to solve them. Study it tonight, and tomorrow we'll see how much you remember." Madison accepted the notebook reverently. Its pages were filled with handwritten recipes, margin notes, and what appeared to be decades of accumulated wisdom. "Are you sure you want me to borrow this?" "Borrow nothing. It's yours now. Every baker needs her own recipe collection, and this will give you a good foundation to build on." The rest of Madison's shift was spent tasting and learning. Margaret walked her through each item they'd prepared, explaining the techniques, the quality markers, and the most common mistakes. Madison filled several pages with notes, her excitement growing with each new piece of knowledge. "Same time tomorrow?" Margaret asked as Madison prepared to leave. "I'll be here." As Madison walked home, she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced since leaving school. This was real work, meaningful work, and she was good at it. More than that, she was passionate about it in a way she'd never been passionate about her academic studies. That evening, Madison spread Margaret's notebook across her small kitchen table and began studying in earnest. Each recipe told a story, modifications made over the years, seasonal variations, notes about which items were most popular with different types of customers. It was like reading the history of the restaurant through the lens of baked goods. The next morning, Madison arrived 10 minutes early to find Margaret already deep in prep work. Ready to get your hands dirty? Margaret asked with a smile. Absolutely. For the next several hours, Madison worked alongside Margaret, measuring ingredients, operating the commercial mixer, and learning to manage multiple timers simultaneously. Her movements were awkward at first. The equipment was much larger and more powerful than anything she'd used before. But Margaret was patient and encouraging. "Don't fight the mixer," Margaret instructed as Madison struggled with a batch of bread dough. "Let it do the work. Your job is to guide, not force." By the end of her second week, Madison had found her rhythm. She could prepare basic items independently, and Margaret had begun trusting her with more complex recipes. The other staff members had welcomed her warmly. Jake Thompson, the head chef, often stopped by the baking station to compliment her croissants, and the servers frequently commented on how much customers were enjoying the pastries. It was during her third week that Madison first encountered the morning rush from the baking side. Margaret had called in sick with flu, leaving Madison to handle the morning prep alone under Jake's supervision. "You sure you can handle this?" Jake asked, concern evident in his voice. "That's a lot of ground to cover." "I can do it," Madison replied, more confident than she felt. "Margaret prepared me for this." For the next 4 hours, Madison worked with focused intensity, drawing on everything Margaret had taught her. She prepared 6 dozen muffins in 3 varieties, 4 dozen scones, 2 coffee cakes, and 3 dozen cookies. By the time the breakfast rush began, the display case was fully stocked with fresh, perfectly baked items. "Impressive," Jake said, surveying her work. "Margaret's going to be proud when she hears about this." But Madison's biggest validation came from the customers themselves. Throughout the morning, servers brought back compliments on the pastries. Mrs. Williams, a regular customer, specifically asked to speak with the baker about her blueberry scones. "I've been coming here for 5 years," Mrs. Williams told Madison when she emerged from the kitchen, "and these are the best scones I've ever had. The texture is perfect. Crispy outside, tender inside. What's your secret?" Madison felt a flush of pride. "Just cold butter and gentle handling. My grandmother always said pastry responds to your mood. If you're tense, it will be tough." As her first month at the Backstage Cafe drew to a close, Madison realized that she'd found more than just a job. She'd found her calling. The work was physically demanding, especially as her pregnancy progressed, but it filled her with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she'd never experienced before. Sarah had noticed her progress as well. During their monthly check-in, she'd offered Madison additional hours and hinted at increased responsibilities. "Margaret tells me you're ready to start developing some of your own recipes," Sarah said. "She thinks you have the skills and the creativity to contribute some new items to our menu." "I'd love that opportunity," Madison replied. "I've been thinking about some variations on my grandmother's recipes that might work well here. Show me what you've got in mind, and we'll do some test batches." That evening, Madison sat in her small apartment, sketching out ideas for new pastries. Her belly was noticeably larger now, and she'd had to buy new uniforms to accommodate her growing size. But she felt more energetic and optimistic than she had in months. She thought about calling her parents to share her good news, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. They'd made their position clear, and she wasn't going to subject herself to more rejection and judgment. Instead, she called Herman Rodriguez to thank him again for his kindness and to let him know that she was doing well. "I knew you had fight in you," Herman said with satisfaction. "That baby is lucky to have a mama with such determination." As Madison prepared for bed, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that October afternoon when she'd met Garth on Broadway. She still didn't know who he was or why he'd chosen to help her, but his intervention had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed her circumstances completely. She was no longer the scared, desperate girl selling cookies on the street. She was Madison Parker, baker at the Backstage Cafe, a woman with skills, purpose, and a future she was building one day at a time. The challenges weren't over. She still had to navigate single motherhood, financial constraints, and the physical demands of her job while pregnant. But she faced them now from a position of strength rather than desperation. Tomorrow would bring new recipes to master, new skills to develop, and new opportunities to prove herself. Madison fell asleep with Margaret's recipe notebook on her nightstand and dreams of the bakery case filled with her own creations. 2 months had passed since Madison began working at the Backstage Cafe, and December had arrived with an unexpected cold snap that left Nashville covered in a thin layer of frost each morning. Madison's belly had grown considerably, making some of her kitchen tasks more challenging, but her skills and confidence continued to develop alongside her pregnancy. She had successfully introduced 3 new items to the menu: honey lavender shortbread cookies inspired by her grandmother's herb garden, maple pecan Danish with a cream cheese filling that had become an instant customer favorite, and bourbon chocolate brownies that perfectly captured Nashville's spirit in dessert form. Each success had earned her not only praise from customers and co-workers, but also a growing sense of professional identity. Margaret had gradually shifted more responsibilities to Madison, preparing for her own partial retirement while ensuring the bakery program remained in capable hands. The transition was proceeding smoothly, with Madison now handling most of the daily baking operations while Margaret focused on special orders and menu development. It was on a particularly busy Friday morning that Madison's world shifted once again, though this time the change came not from kindness, but from recognition. She was pulling a tray of her signature Danish from the oven when she heard a familiar voice from the dining room. Her hands froze on the oven door as the voice registered in her memory. Confident, warm, with that distinctive Oklahoma drawl she'd heard only once before, but had never forgotten. "Morning, Sarah. The usual table available?" "Of course, Garth. Right this way." Madison's heart began to race as the pieces suddenly clicked into place. Garth, the restaurant owner who'd been so kind to her, who'd changed her life with a single act of generosity. She'd been working at his restaurant for 2 months and had never made the connection. But now, hearing his voice in context, seeing the way the staff treated him with familiar respect rather than star-struck awe, she realized why he'd seemed familiar that day on Broadway. Garth Brooks, one of the most successful country music artists of all time, and she'd been selling him cookies on a street corner without having any idea who he was. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on survival, so disconnected from popular culture during her months of struggle, that she'd failed to recognize someone whose face was known worldwide. More importantly, she now understood why his offer of help had seemed so natural, so effortless. He had the resources to change lives without even thinking about it. "Madison, you okay?" Jake's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she managed, though her hands were still shaking as she set down the hot tray. "Just need some air for a minute." She stepped out the back door into the cold December morning, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Her mind was reeling with questions and emotions she couldn't quite sort through. Gratitude, certainly. The man had literally saved her life. But also embarrassment at her own ignorance, and a strange sense of betrayal that no one had told her who her benefactor really was. "Hey," Margaret's voice was soft behind her. "Want to talk about what just spooked you in there?" Madison turned to face the older woman, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Did you know? When Garth brought me here, did you know who he was?" Margaret's expression grew gentle with understanding. "So you figured it out. Why didn't anyone tell me? I've been working here for 2 months, And no one thought to mention that the person who rescued me from the streets is one of the most famous musicians in the world. Because it doesn't matter, Margaret said simply. Not to him, and not to us. Garth Brooks, the celebrity, might be worth millions and sell out stadiums, but Garth the person is just a man who saw someone in need and decided to help. Which version matters more to you? Madison considered this, her breath still coming in short puffs in the cold air. I don't know. Both, I guess. I mean, I'm grateful either way, but it changes things, doesn't it? Knowing that he could have helped me and 1,000 other people without even noticing the expense. Does it? Margaret challenged. You've earned every dollar you've made here. You've worked hard, learned fast, and contributed to this place in ways that have nothing to do with how you got the job. Your worth isn't diminished by his wealth. Before Madison could respond, the back door opened and Sarah appeared. Madison, Garth is asking to speak with you, if you're comfortable with that. Madison's stomach dropped. He wants to see me? He recognized your work, Sarah explained. The Danish he ordered? He asked who'd developed the recipe. And when I told him it was you, he said he'd like to say hello. Madison looked down at her flour-dusted apron, her expanding belly, her comfortable but decidedly unglamorous work clothes. I must look terrible. You look like a baker who's been working hard all morning, Margaret said firmly. There's honor in that. Taking a deep breath, Madison followed Sarah back into the restaurant. Garth was seated at a corner table, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking far more approachable than his larger-than-life public image suggested. When he saw her approaching, he stood and smiled. The same warm, genuine expression she remembered from that day on Broadway. Madison, he said, extending his hand. It's good to see you again. You look well. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, she replied, accepting his handshake. I have to apologize. I didn't realize who you were when we met. I feel foolish. Please, call me Garth. And there's nothing foolish about it. He gestured for her to sit down across from him. If anything, I was glad you didn't recognize me. It meant you saw me as just another person, not as someone to be impressed by or intimidated by. Madison settled into the chair, acutely aware of her pregnant belly and hoping she didn't look as nervous as she felt. I want to thank you, she began. This job, this opportunity, it's changed my entire life. I don't know how I can ever repay you. You already have, Garth said simply. Sarah tells me you've become one of their most valuable employees. Margaret says you're ready to take over most of her responsibilities. That's not charity paying off, Madison. That's your own hard work and talent. But if I hadn't what? Bought some excellent cookies from a talented baker? Garth's tone was gentle but firm. Madison, I didn't create your skills. I didn't give you your work ethic or your determination. All I did was provide an introduction. Everything else, everything that matters, came from you. Madison felt tears threatening and blinked them back. It's still more than anyone else was willing to do. Unfortunately, that says more about other people than it does about me. Garth leaned forward slightly. Can I tell you something? I've got 3 daughters, and I hope I've raised them to be strong and independent. But if they ever found themselves in a situation like yours, I'd want them to know that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. I've been struggling with that, Madison admitted, feeling like I should be able to handle everything on my own. None of us handle everything on our own. We just like to pretend we do. Garth smiled. Even someone in my position depends on hundreds of people. Musicians, sound engineers, venue staff, record label executives, fans who buy tickets and albums. Success is always a team effort, even when only one person gets their name on the marquee. Madison found herself relaxing as they talked. This wasn't the intimidating encounter with a celebrity she'd feared. It was a conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. "How are you feeling about the baby?" Garth asked. "When are you due?" "Mid-January, about 6 weeks from now." Madison's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "I'm nervous, but excited, and grateful that I'll have the support of this place when the time comes. Sarah's good people. She'll take care of you." Garth paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Madison, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but do you have everything you need for the baby? I know starting out can be expensive." Madison felt her cheeks flush. Even knowing who he was now, even understanding that what seemed like a fortune to her was probably insignificant to him, her pride still balked at accepting more help. "I'm managing," she said carefully. "I've been saving as much as I can, and there's a consignment shop in East Nashville that has good baby items at reasonable prices." Garth nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you change your mind, or if anything comes up, please don't hesitate to ask. Consider it an investment in the future of this restaurant's baking program." They talked for a few more minutes about the restaurant, Madison's plans for new menu items, and her hopes for balancing work and motherhood. Throughout the conversation, Garth treated her as an equal, not as someone to be pitied or managed, but as a professional whose opinions and concerns mattered. When he finally stood to leave, Garth shook her hand again. "Madison, I want you to remember something. That day, I met you on Broadway. You weren't just surviving. You were surviving with dignity and grace. That impressed me more than any amount of talent or skill could have. Your baby is lucky to have a mother with that kind of strength." As Madison watched him leave, she felt a complex mix of emotions. The embarrassment at not recognizing him had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of the man behind the fame. He could have simply written a check and felt good about his charity. Instead, he'd provided an opportunity and then stepped back to let her succeed, or fail, on her own merits. Margaret appeared at her elbow. "How was that?" "Humbling," Madison replied honestly. "But in a good way, I think. He made me realize that I've been so focused on what I owe him that I haven't been fully appreciating what I've accomplished." "Smart man. Fame hasn't gone to his head the way it does with some people." As Madison returned to the kitchen to finish the morning's baking, she carried with her a new perspective on her situation. She was still Madison Parker, unmarried pregnant teenager whose family had abandoned her. But she was also Madison Parker, talented baker, valued employee, and woman building a life through her own determination and skill. The knowledge of Garth's identity didn't change the fundamental reality of her situation, but it did provide context for the kindness she'd received. In a world where celebrities often used charity as a public relations tool, Garth had helped her quietly, without seeking recognition or praise. That spoke to a character that went far deeper than his public image. That evening, as Madison worked on developing a new recipe for Valentine's Day cupcakes, she found herself thinking about legacy. Garth Brooks would be remembered for his music, his record sales, his sold-out concerts, but she would remember him for a moment of human kindness that had changed the trajectory of her life. In 6 weeks, she would become a mother herself. She hoped that someday she would have the opportunity to pass along the same kind of kindness that had been shown to her, to see someone in need and respond not with judgment or indifference, but with compassion and practical help. The baby kicked, a strong movement that made Madison pause in her recipe development. "What do you think?" she asked, resting her hand on her belly. "Should we add a touch of cinnamon to these cupcakes, or keep them simple?" Another kick, this one almost seeming like approval. Madison smiled and reached for the cinnamon. She was no longer the desperate girl selling cookies on the street, but she would never forget where she'd come from. or the people who'd helped her along the way. January arrived in Nashville with an ice storm that closed roads and left the city sparkling like a crystal wonderland. Madison was now just 2 weeks from her due date, and the physical demands of baking had become increasingly challenging. Margaret had insisted on handling the heavier tasks, while Madison focused on the delicate work that required finesse rather than strength. The restaurant had become like a second family to her over the past 4 months. Sarah had arranged for her to have flexible scheduling after the baby arrived, with the option to bring the infant to work when necessary. Jake had surprised her with a handmade high chair for the kitchen, crafted in his spare time from reclaimed wood. Even the servers had pitched in, creating a small fund to help with baby expenses. It was during the quiet hours of early morning prep, 3 days before her due date, that Madison went into labor. She was mixing a batch of scone dough when the first contraction hit, strong enough to make her gasp and grip the edge of the counter. "Oh," she breathed, recognizing immediately what was happening. She'd been having false contractions for weeks, but this was different. Deeper, more insistent, with a quality that told her body was finally ready. Margaret looked up from where she was rolling out pie crust. "Madison? What's wrong?" I think it's time." Another contraction followed quickly, confirming her suspicions. What followed was controlled chaos, as the restaurant staff sprang into action. Sarah called for a taxi, while Margaret helped Madison gather her things. Jake took over the baking duties without being asked, and Linda Martinez, the morning shift manager, called Madison's doctor to let them know she was on her way to the hospital. "You've got this," Margaret said, squeezing Madison's hand as they waited for the taxi. "You're stronger than you know." The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 14 hours. Madison had never felt more alone than during those hours in the hospital room, with only the nurses for company. She'd prepared for this moment as best she could, taking childbirth classes and reading every book she could find. But nothing had really prepared her for the intensity of bringing another human being into the world. At 11:47 p.m. on January 15th, Emma Grace Parker entered the world with a cry that seemed to announce her intention to make her presence known. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of pink, wrinkled humanity with a shock of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with grave curiosity. As Madison held her daughter for the first time, she was overwhelmed by a love so fierce and complete that it took her breath away. This tiny person was hers to protect, to nurture, to guide through whatever challenges life might bring. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Hello, Emma," Madison whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama, and I'm going to take such good care of you." The next morning brought visitors from the backstage cafe. Sarah arrived with flowers and a care package of homemade soup and bread. Margaret came bearing a hand-knitted blanket she'd been secretly working on for weeks. Even Jake stopped by, awkward but sincere in his congratulations. But the surprise visitor was Garth, who appeared in the doorway of Madison's hospital room carrying a large gift bag and wearing a slightly nervous expression. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "Sarah told me the good news, and I wanted to stop by to congratulate you. Please come in." Madison shifted Emma in her arms, proud to show off her daughter. "Garth, I'd like you to meet Emma Grace Parker." Garth approached the bed with the careful reverence people reserve for newborns. "She's beautiful, Madison. Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her? Are you sure? I haven't held a baby this small in years." Madison carefully transferred Emma to Garth's experienced arms. Despite his claims of being out of practice, he held her with the natural confidence of someone who'd raised children of his own. Emma seemed to approve, settling peacefully against his chest. "She's got your determination already," Garth observed, studying Emma's alert expression. "I can tell she's going to be a force to be reckoned with." "I hope so. She's going to need to be strong." Garth looked up from the baby to meet Madison's eyes. "She will be. She's got an incredible example to follow." He handed Madison the gift bag he'd brought. "Just a few things I thought you might be able to use." Inside, Madison found practical items that showed thoughtful consideration. Baby clothes in various sizes, diapers, formula, bottles, and a beautiful wooden jewelry box with Emma's name engraved on the lid. "For when she's older," Garth explained, noticing Madison's questioning look at the jewelry box. "Every little girl should have a special place to keep her treasures." But at the bottom of the bag was something that made Madison's breath catch. A college savings account book with Emma's name on it, showing an initial deposit of $10,000. "Garth, I can't accept this," Madison said, her voice shaking. "It's too much." "It's not for you," Garth replied gently. "It's for Emma. Every child deserves the opportunity to pursue their dreams, and education is the key to making that possible." Madison looked down at her sleeping daughter, then back at the man who had already done so much for them. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why do you keep helping us?" Garth was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been blessed with more success than I ever dreamed possible. I've sold millions of records, played for millions of people, earned more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But none of that matters as much as the moments when you can make a real difference in someone's life." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "That day I met you on Broadway. You could have been angry at the world. You could have been bitter about your circumstances or resentful of people who had more than you did. Instead, you were sitting there with dignity, working hard to take care of yourself and your baby. That impressed me more than any performance I've ever given." "I was terrified," Madison admitted. "I didn't feel dignified at all." "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Madison. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You've shown more courage in the past year than most people show in a lifetime." As if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, Emma stirred in Madison's arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up. Madison adjusted her position, marveling again at the perfect tiny fingers and the way Emma's eyes seemed to focus on her face. "What are your plans now?" Garth asked. "Sarah mentioned you're planning to come back to work part-time. In about 6 weeks, if everything goes well. Sarah's been wonderful about accommodating my situation. I know it's not ideal, bringing a baby to work, but it's not uncommon in family businesses," Garth interrupted. "And that's what we are, a family. Emma will grow up surrounded by people who care about her and want to see her succeed." "I still can't believe this is my life now," Madison said, looking around the hospital room at the flowers and gifts from her restaurant family. "6 months ago, I was alone and terrified. Now I have Emma, and I have all of you." "You were never really alone," Garth said. "You just hadn't found your tribe yet. Now you have. And Emma will grow up knowing she's part of something special." After Garth left, Madison sat in the quiet hospital room holding her daughter and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been the path she'd originally planned. She'd imagined getting married before having children, finishing college, having a traditional family structure. But perhaps this path, difficult as it had been, was leading her towards something better than what she'd originally imagined. Emma would grow up in a world where kindness mattered more than blood relations, where family was defined by choice and commitment rather than genetics. She would learn that success wasn't just about personal achievement, but about lifting others up along the way. Most importantly, she would know that even when circumstances seemed impossible, there were people in the world who would step up to help if you had the courage to accept their kindness. 2 days later, Madison brought Emma home to the small East Nashville apartment that no longer felt cramped, but cozy. Herman Rodriguez had surprised her by painting the bedroom and installing a ceiling fan, his way of welcoming the newest resident. The refrigerator was stocked with meals from various restaurant staff members, and a bassinet Margaret had borrowed from her granddaughter was set up beside Madison's bed. As Madison settled into the rocking chair Herman had found at a yard sale and restored, feeding Emma her first bottle at home, she thought about the letter she wanted to write to her daughter someday. She would tell Emma about the kindness of strangers, about the importance of hard work and dignity, about how one person's compassion could change the trajectory of an entire life. But most of all, she would tell Emma about the day a country music superstar bought cookies from a pregnant teenager on Broadway and saw not a charity case, but a person worthy of respect and opportunity. That act of recognition had changed everything, not because of the man's fame or wealth, but because of his willingness to see her humanity and respond to it with kindness. Outside the apartment window, Nashville was waking up to another day of possibilities. Somewhere in the city, other young people were struggling with impossible circumstances. Other families were facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. But Madison now knew something she hadn't known 6 months ago. There were people in the world who would help, if you had the courage to accept their assistance and the determination to make the most of the opportunities they provided. Emma finished her bottle and settled against Madison's shoulder with a contented sigh. In a few weeks, they would return to the Backstage Cafe, where Emma would become the youngest member of their extended family. Madison would continue developing her skills as a baker, perhaps eventually opening her own place someday. Emma would grow up surrounded by the warmth and chaos of a restaurant kitchen, learning early that family comes in many forms, and that success is measured not just in personal achievement, but in the positive impact you have on others. As Madison rocked her daughter in the quiet apartment, she hummed a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her years ago. The melody seemed to soothe Emma, whose breathing grew deep and regular as she drifted off to sleep. Outside, the city hummed with its own rhythm, the eternal song of dreams being chased, chances being taken, and lives being transformed by the simple decision to treat each other with kindness and respect. Madison's story was far from over. There would be challenges ahead: sleepless nights, financial struggles, the complex task of raising a child alone. But she faced those challenges now from a position of strength, surrounded by people who believed in her and supported by the knowledge that she had already overcome obstacles that once seemed impossible. As she transferred the sleeping Emma to her bassinet and prepared for her own much-needed rest, Madison whispered a prayer of gratitude for her daughter, for her job, for the people who had become her chosen family, and for a country music legend who had seen her worth on a day when she'd almost forgotten it herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, home with her daughter, building a life filled with hope and possibility. The gift Garth had given her wasn't just money or a job opportunity. It was the chance to believe in herself again, to see that her circumstances didn't define her worth, and to understand that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a step toward strength. That gift would continue to multiply as Madison paid it forward in her own way, creating a ripple effect of kindness that would touch lives she might never even know about. In the quiet darkness of the East Nashville apartment, two lives intertwined in sleep: a young mother who had found her strength, and a baby girl who would grow up knowing that the world, despite its challenges, was fundamentally full of good people willing to help each other along the way. It was, Madison reflected as she drifted off to sleep, exactly the kind of legacy she wanted to leave for her daughter. Not just the knowledge that she was loved, but the understanding that love, in all its forms, had the power to transform lives and change the world, one act of kindness at a time.